So this is how the glorious D&D bubble pops, huh? Through copious amounts of greed. Hello everyone, welcome back to Fraud on the Telly. Today we're discussing the absolute cluster that is the new Wizards of the Coast OGL license. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last week and a half, you would have seen the absolute calamitous state that the D&D community has found itself in after a potential change to Wizards of the Coast D&D license agreement was leaked, and some of the changes in this agreement could absolutely kill the modern D&D space as you know it. In this video, I'm going to be giving you a breakdown on this whole situation, trying to explain it in as much simplified detail as possible using our law school dropout brain and giving you my thoughts, as well as talking about the effect that it's going to have or potentially could have on the D&D space, D&D content creators like Critical Role, but most importantly, on the effect that it could have on you and me, the average D&D player. So what is the OGL? Essentially, it's an open game licensing agreement that has stood in place by Wizards of the Coast for over 20 years now. This essentially allows people, companies, to open source license certain elements of D&D, like core mechanics, broad narrative, and story elements, certain things like this for use in other projects that could be potentially monetized. This agreement is essentially the spawn of the modern tabletop era that we live in, as basically almost any D&D supplementary content not put out by Wizards, as well as a ton of other tabletop RPGs that have emerged over the last 20 years, like Pathfinder, are the result of the OGL. Yes, even Pathfinder is the result of the OGL, a game mechanic system that has, if anything, super broad, relatively little relation to the actual mechanics of D&D. This extends to supplementary guides, campaign setting guides, all new tabletop RPG systems, anything that uses any kind of skeleton of D&D or any kind of system that has applied for the OGL game license over the last basically 20 plus years, which is essentially almost everything in the D&D space. So what is the problem here? Well, the problem for Wizards, apparently, and Hasbro, its parent company, is that much of this fan content is now better than their own content, and in their mind is directly competing with Wizards, i.e. Pathfinder, for a good example, and is basically taking money out of their pocket. This is when we enter our new license, what is referred to as OGL 1.1, a potential leaked new license that would change basically everything about the D&D landscape as we know it. So what exactly would this new license do? Well, number one, it would make the original license no longer authorized, which means that no new content could be released for any older editions or any kind of system that used this old agreement. Obviously, that is unless they were to sign on to the new agreement, but we're going to get into that later and maybe why they wouldn't want to do that. Now, apparently, this new agreement seems to only apply for the creation of RPG and supplements in printed and static electronic formats. Now, this is very important because a lot of people were worried that D&D content that was streamed or YouTube channels that covered D&D content, such as Critical Role or name your favorite D&D YouTuber, would somehow be affected by this new guideline. At the moment, doesn't seem like it's the case. However, importantly to note, there is a section in this leaked guidelines which does say that at any point, Wizards could retroactively change any of these rules, so they could potentially, this could potentially would affect content such as this, but at the moment it doesn't seem like that is the case. As well, creators under these new guidelines which now report to Wizards of the Coast how much money they believe this product will make, as well as potential pricing information, as well as just a ton of information that at the moment they don't have to give Wizards of the Coast. Imagine a company like Pathfinder, Green Ronin, any of these supplemental companies, as well as other newer tabletop companies, having to give Wizards of the Coast their financial reports over how much money they make, how much they intend to make. Yeah, you can see why maybe some of these companies that have been running alone this whole entire time may not want to do that. Arguably, some of the most fucked up legal jargon in this new agreement is this, though. According to the information, it says, you agreed to give us non-exclusive, perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, sub-licensable, royalty-free license to use that content for any purpose. Basically, when we translate this legal jargon, this essentially means you are giving Wizard permission to use your content whenever they want, and that this is perpetual and irrevocable. You cannot change your mind at a later date. Once this contract is signed, you are locked in for life, baby. They own your ass now, and they can use your content in any way they like. If Pathfinder were to sign this, basically they're giving Wizards permission to publish, use Pathfinder in whatever way they like in any official Wizards capacity, and that doesn't matter anytime in the future. Once you're locked into this, it's basically, according to this contract, irreversible. To top it all off, Wizards can modify or terminate this agreement for any reason whatsoever, provided they give the entity 30 days notice. Essentially, one of the biggest complaints from the community that seem to understand this agreement is that if this leaked agreement were to become finalized, it essentially is giving complete monopoly control over the tabletop role-playing space in Dungeons & Dragons space to Wizards. Not to mention, to top it all off, there's a little section here about the termination of license for content that is blatantly racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, bigoted, or otherwise discriminatory. Now, on the surface, this does not seem like a bad thing. If anything, this seems like maybe one of the only good things that would come out of this 1.1 license agreement. The problem is the last part of the wording here, otherwise discriminatory. The fact is that this definition is ultimately up to the subject of Wizards. They can define what otherwise discriminatory means in any aspect they would like under this agreement. So essentially, this little clause here could give Wizards carte blanche to basically label anything that they don't like as discriminatory in some kind of way, and take this licensing agreement from them whenever they want, which essentially would completely kill the product. Essentially, like we said, this is Wizards monopolizing the tabletop D&D basically space, because if you don't sign this licensing agreement, all that content that you made previously, all that content that Green Ronin put out, all that content that Pathfinder has put out, you name it really, any kind of D&D supplemental guides, any D&D like online web magazine space. There's so many things here that would be affected by this, and if they don't sign this, their content is essentially gone, kaput, zilch, nada. It never existed. Now, a lot of people are wondering, how does this really affect me as a D&D player, as the casual D&D player? Well, it affects you more than you might think if you haven't already understood everything that I've said so far, because essentially this would mean that much of the homebrew content that is put out and used by the community would go bye-bye. More interestingly, though, to me, if you're someone who uses virtual tabletop system, who plays at home online with friends, you're no longer going to be able to host any former OGL content. This essentially would mean if you were playing any other game that uses an OGL license, like Pathfinder, which we use as an example here, that shit's no longer going to be available to be used on Foundry or any other virtual tabletop. You're basically going to be locked into D&D content and D&D content alone. And when I say D&D content, I mean basically only Wizards content, or anyone that basically is cucked enough to sign this agreement, because basically they're holding their feet over the fire. Now, what does this mean for streamers and YouTubers, though? If I'm someone who streams D&D for a living, will this somehow affect me? Or if I'm a YouTuber that makes D&D content, will this somehow affect me? Now, like we said, in the moment, at this form of the leaked document, this shouldn't affect these type of content creators, though, like we said, they do have the ability to, at any point in the future, retroactively change this agreement to where it could. As well, like we said, there is that little bit about otherwise discriminatory and termination of licensing here. So it's potentially possible that Wizards, if they didn't like what you were saying about D&D or their product, could go after you under these types of guidelines. I guess potentially you could be violating copyright, though it's really all up in the air. I've seen a lot of content creators freaking out and saying that this could mean the death of D&D content creators, especially like on YouTube and Twitch? I'm not entirely sure. Though when you think about it, these streams, whether it's YouTube or Twitch, are being monetized. It is D&D content that is monetized through ad revenue. So it would potentially, I would think, fall under this agreement. I guess if it didn't say specifically that this agreement is used to monitor, what is the exact wording again? Creation of RPG and supplements in printed and static electronic formats. Now, static electronic formats, I assume, means PDF. This doesn't seem like it means video streaming. So it seems like companies like Critical Role, at least as far as the streaming goes, will continue to exist. Though, if I had to guess, you're probably going to see them move even farther away from Wizard trademark names, such as the name of gods, and other names and things that are trademarked by Wizards, but we've already seen Critical Role basically do that. Speaking of Critical Role, though, this would apply to, I guess, any Critical Role supplementary guide or any type of game system that they put out in the future or have put out in the past. If they've released it under these guidelines, which, like we've said, guys, most tabletop companies that have released tabletop games have done so. They've released it under this open source guidelines, because in the past, over the last 20 years, regardless of how much D&D content you're actually taking that is open source, it could be basically none. They would release it under these guidelines because it's just the easier thing to do. It just was the standard practice to do. Now, the thing is that Critical Role is easily one of the most profitable D&D companies out there, and Wizards is incentivized to work with them, so they'll most likely be offering them some kind of a special license, I had to guess, because remember, Critical Role makes crazy money yearly from all of their different revenue streams, and Wizards most likely want to have their hand in that pot because it's absolutely massive, and it seems only likely that they would offer them some kind of special license agreement that would be different from the standard license agreement that probably gives them really good terms. Now, if everything continues to go forward as we see here, and this 1.1 agreement goes into practice, and Critical Role does sign a special license agreement, well, this is tough shit for basically everyone else. If you're a Critical Role fan, I highly encourage you all to push back on them online to not sign any type of special licensing agreement or any agreement at all. Because basically this would just be essentially them catching the bag for themselves, but all of the other D&D community that isn't big enough to get this type of agreement. The only reason the D&D community has grown so large over the last few years, the only reason that 5e has become so successful really is from, in my opinion, the broad D&D community itself. It's kind of a loop feedback process. D&D creates 5e, a more mainstream D&D game. The rise of D&D content with streaming and YouTube leads to the success of 5e, along with 5e being a more baseline, easier to understand, basically a more vanilla normie type game system. There is a feedback loop here. 5e would not be as successful as it would be today if not for all of the fan content created. It's like Critical Role and many other supplementary products. Frankly, that's to say because a lot of the Wizards products that are put out for D&D are frankly hot garbage when compared to the copious amounts of fan content that are put out. So like we've said before, essentially this 1.1 agreement, if it were to go into effect how it is right now, would potentially kill the tabletop space as we know it. Like we said, Pathfinder was signed under this old OGL agreement. With the changes that Wizards are making, not only can those publishers not release Pathfinder's tie-in products anymore, but Paizo, the company, arguably cannot reference their own product anymore, since it was released as part of this open game content from the beginning. Essentially, if anyone made a product under this first OGL agreement and they don't sign the new agreement, which essentially hands over all of the rights of their product to Wizards, it's almost like their product never existed at all to begin with. It was really only a matter of time, in my opinion, until the D&D bubble popped. All big bubbles of popularity, especially in subcultures, will eventually pop. This D&D revolution, this D&D kind of renaissance has been amazing, but it really doesn't surprise me that at the end of the day, the thing that could potentially kill this modern D&D renaissance is greed, especially when you consider this is coming from a company like Hasbro and Wizards, which you'll remember are the creator of a game like Magic the Gathering. And if you know anything about Magic the Gathering, one of the biggest things that people critique have been one of the killers of Magic the Gathering has been greed. In short, this new agreement is basically Wizards' attempt to try to clamp down on other third-party companies that have been making D&D tie-in products and other D&D-esque products because they feel that they're not getting their fair share of the pot, but in reality, the only reason that their product, D&D 5e, is as successful as it is right now is because of all of the other supplementary fan products, because Wizards, you guys make pretty mid content. So what can we do as a D&D community? Frankly, there's really not a lot we can do. Like we've said, this is just the leaked OGL agreement. This may not actually be the finalized agreement that comes, but even so, I don't have high hopes. Honestly, one of the best things you can do is try to press back against Wizards of the Coast online. A lot of people are doing D&D boycotts. I'm not going to go as far as to say and do that. I'm very curious to see where Critical Role will end up lying in the dust where this whole thing emerges. Critical Role stands at kind of the precipice here on what's going to happen in the big D&D space. They have the power to really push back on Wizards and make them rethink what they're doing here, at least in my opinion. Not only does Critical Role have the financial backing to kind of put up a fight against Wizards, they have the fan base to do so, which arguably could even be more important. Critical Role fans are absolute diehards, so much so that they'll continue to support them, even if they were to take this kind of special agreement deal, which would potentially snake the rest of the D&D community financially. Though if they were to use this power of this fan base for good, they could really put some major pushback and really hold Wizards feet to the coals here, per se. Make this pretty clear. This is a bold reach by Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro here to try to go back on an agreement that has stood for over 25 years that a lot of companies have basically built their livelihoods on, companies both small and big. And if this leaked agreement goes into effect, the D&D space is probably going to change forever and probably not for the better. As always, guys, I look forward to seeing your comments and thoughts in the comment section down below. I want to hear all your thoughts. Let me know any other information I missed about the OGL. This is a complex topic. There's lots of legal jargon in here. I did a decent amount of research before I even wanted to talk about this because it is really complicated and I didn't want to I guess sound like an absolute dumbass. As always, guys, I hope to see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. This is a crazy world we live in. Until next time, peace, love, adieu.